17 months of pressure didn't break Canada. It didn't bend it. It didn't bring it back to the negotiating table on Washington's terms. Then Mark Carney spoke 5 words. And in that moment, the entire logic of the trade war stopped behaving like a negotiation and started behaving like a conclusion. Not a turning point, not a warning, a final statement that markets, governments, and corporations all recognized at the same time, even if no one said it out loud yet. Because sometimes power doesn't collapse loudly, it just stops working. And what followed was not a reaction, it was recognition. Because the moment those 5 words entered public space, nothing fundamentally new happened in the structure of the trade war. What changed was that the structure could no longer be misread. For 17 months, the conflict between Washington and Ottawa had operated inside a layer of interpretation. Each tariff was described as leverage. Each countermeasure was described as escalation. Each negotiation was described as progress. Each pause was described as strategy. But beneath all of that language, something more stable had been forming. A pattern of adaptation on one side and an assumption of control on the other. The United States believed it was managing the tempo of the conflict. Canada had already begun adjusting to the possibility that the tempo no longer mattered. This difference is subtle at first, almost invisible in real time, but over long periods it becomes decisive. Because control in a trade conflict is not measured by who speaks more often. It is measured by who adjusts less. And by the time Mark Carney entered the center of this story, that imbalance had already shifted in ways that were no longer reversible through negotiation alone. This is why the 5 words mattered. Not because they introduced a new policy, not because they announced a new agreement, but because they acknowledged in public form what had already been taking shape in private behavior. Canada does not negotiate ultimatums. On the surface, it was a sentence about process, about negotiation posture, about diplomatic boundaries. But in the context of 17 months of accumulated pressure, it functioned as something else entirely. A declaration that the framework itself had changed. And once a framework changes, all previous assumptions inside it become obsolete. The reaction did not begin in political circles. It began in pricing systems. Because markets do not wait for official interpretation. They respond to structure before language catches up. Within minutes of the statement, trading desks across New York, Toronto, and London were no longer debating what had been said. They were recalculating what it meant that it had been said at all, not as rhetoric, but as signal. And signals, in high-volume economic systems, are often more important than policy details, because signals determine expectations, and expectations determine positioning, and positioning determines price. That chain reaction is what turned 5 words into a market event. But the deeper story was not in the immediate movement. It was in the absence of confusion. There was no prolonged debate among major institutions about interpretation, no competing narratives that required days of clarification, no sustained disagreement about intent. That absence itself was the signal. Because when large, sophisticated systems all arrive at the same interpretation quickly, it usually means the information was not ambiguous to begin with. It means the conclusion had already been internalized. Carney had not introduced uncertainty, he had removed it. And that is why the statement carried more weight than its length suggested. 17 months of diplomatic language had kept the conflict in a state of controlled ambiguity, a space where both sides could continue operating without fully committing to the reality of what the data was already showing. But ambiguity is not a permanent condition. It exists only as long as it is useful. And eventually, one side reaches a point where continuing to maintain it is more costly than ending it. What followed Carney's statement was not escalation, it was compression, the slow collapsing of interpretive space between what had been assumed and what could no longer be denied. In Washington, the initial assumption was that the statement would be absorbed into the existing negotiation framework. Another data point, another position, another round of rhetoric in a long-running dispute. But within hours, internal assessments began shifting, not because policy had changed, but because expectation had changed. And expectation is the hidden variable in every extended economic confrontation. If you believe the other side will eventually adjust, you behave one way. If you believe they will not, you behave another. Carney's 5 words removed the first assumption from consideration, not through aggression, but through clarity. And clarity in high-stakes economic relationships can be more destabilizing than confrontation. Because confrontation invites response, clarity forces recalculation, and recalculation forces acknowledgement of limits. That is what made this moment structurally different from earlier phases of the conflict. Earlier statements had been absorbed into the cycle. This one was not. It settled. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was final in tone, even if not formally final in law. And in systems this large, tone often becomes function. What could not be ignored anymore was the direction of travel that had been visible for months, but now had a defined endpoint. The trade war had not suddenly ended. It had been reaching its conclusion in slow motion through every adjustment, every investment decision, every supply chain shift that quietly moved away from temporary assumptions. Carney's statement did not initiate that process, it confirmed it. And once confirmation enters the system at that level, reversal becomes exponentially more difficult. Because now the debate is no longer about what is happening. It is about whether anyone is still willing to behave as if it is not happening. And that is where the real shift begins. The first sign that something had structurally changed was not political. It was behavioral. Because in conflicts of this scale, governments rarely move first. Institutions do. Corporations do. Capital does. Governments usually respond after those adjustments have already taken place. And that is exactly what began to happen in the hours and days following Carney's 5 words. Not panic, not celebration, adjustment. Quiet, methodical, almost procedural adjustment across systems that are designed to minimize exposure to uncertainty. Supply chain managers did not wait for official clarifications. They recalibrated risk models. Investment committees did not wait for press conferences. They reweighted assumptions about North American trade stability. Energy stakeholders did not wait for diplomatic briefings. They updated projections based on continuity of current conditions rather than reversal. And none of this required consensus. It required alignment with perceived reality. Because once a signal is strong enough, institutions do not debate it in public. They incorporate it internally. This is the point where most political narratives lose accuracy. They focus on statements. Markets focus on consequences. And consequences had already begun moving before any formal interpretation of Carney's words had fully settled in political discourse. Inside Washington, the initial framing was still procedural. A statement from Ottawa. A reaffirmation of negotiating posture. A rhetorical boundary-setting exercise typical of long diplomatic engagements. But that interpretation began to weaken as incoming data failed to support it. Because if the statement was merely rhetorical, behavior would have remained unchanged. It did not. Trade exposure models began shifting. Contractual assumptions began extending into longer time horizons without expectation of near-term resolution. Insurance frameworks adjusted premiums for continuity risk rather than temporary disruption. This is what separates perception from structure. Perception can be debated, structure cannot. And by the time analysts in major financial institutions began compiling early assessments, a pattern was already emerging that did not match the expectation of an ongoing, unresolved negotiation. It matched something else: stabilization around a new baseline. Not resolution in the legal sense, but resolution in the operational sense. And that distinction is critical, because legal resolution requires agreement. Operational resolution requires behavior. And behavior had already started converging on a different assumption. That assumption was simple. The trade war as a dynamic system was no longer expanding. It was settling. Not because tensions had disappeared, but because the range of possible outcomes had narrowed. And in economic systems, narrowing outcomes is often indistinguishable from resolution. The more this became visible, the more Washington faced a different kind of problem. Not escalation, but interpretation lag. The gap between what policy intended and what markets were now pricing. That gap is dangerous in any strategic environment, because it creates a situation where actions taken to influence perception arrive too late to change structure. This is what made Carney's timing decisive. He did not speak at the beginning of a shift. He spoke at the point where the shift had already occurred, but had not yet been publicly acknowledged. And once acknowledgement enters the system, it accelerates alignment. That is what happened next. Not a reversal of positions, but a convergence of expectations. Inside corporate planning departments, the language changed subtly, from "if tariffs are reduced" to "if tariffs persist," from temporary disruption to structural adjustment, from "wait and see" to "assume continuity." Each phrase shift is small in isolation. Together, they represent a complete reorientation of strategy. This is the moment when political conflict becomes economic reality, because once companies stop treating uncertainty as temporary, the system stops behaving as if resolution is imminent. And when that happens, political leverage becomes less elastic. It still exists, but it no longer stretches in the same way. The United States remained powerful in every conventional sense: market size, currency influence, investment flows, technological leadership. But power alone does not guarantee directional control in systems that have already adapted. And adaptation had already occurred. The most significant misunderstanding in the early phase of the conflict was the assumption that pressure would produce linear responses, that more pressure would equal more compliance. But in integrated economies, responses are not linear. They are structural. And once structures adjust, additional pressure often produces diminishing returns. This was the reality beginning to take hold across multiple layers of the system, not openly acknowledged, but increasingly reflected in decisions that could not easily be reversed. At this stage, the conflict was no longer defined by who was escalating. It was defined by who had already adapted. And that answer, increasingly, was becoming visible in the data, not in speeches, not in announcements, but in the quiet architecture of economic behavior. Which is why, when the political interpretation finally caught up to the economic reality, it did so with a sense of delay rather than discovery, because by then the system had already moved forward. And systems, once they move, do not wait for permission to continue.